Welcome to our video lecture on topic 2.2, water. Our essential understanding: water is the medium of life. And our objectives: we're going to explain the polarity of water, describe the properties of water and how those properties support some life processes, and then we're going to define hydrophilic, hydrophobic, and amphipathic. Water is the medium of life. What does that even mean? Well, according to dictionary.com, a medium is an intervening substance. Basically, we're saying that most of the things that happen in us living systems happen dissolved in water. Water is that substance that allows for all those chemical reactions of metabolism to occur. One of the reasons that water is so amazing is because water is polar. That means that there is a partial negative side on one part of the water molecule and a partial positive side on the other part of the water molecule. The reason for this is electronegativity differences. Little bit of chemistry review. Electronegativity. Sorry, I got distracted in that spelling. So electrons are pulled more strongly toward oxygen because oxygen is more electronegative than is hydrogen. So those electrons hang out here a little bit more. That makes the oxygen side of the water molecule a little bit negative. Partial negative, that's a lowercase delta. So we have that partial negative charge on the oxygen side. We have a partial positive side on the hydrogens because the electrons are not so close. And so it's left to be a little bit positive since it's not negative. Because we have a negative side and a positive side, when that next water molecule comes along, we end up with opposites attracting. Those opposites attracting looks kind of like this. That hydrogen side of a water molecule is partially positive. The oxygen side is partially negative. And then these opposites attract. That force of attraction is called a hydrogen bond. We've got one there. We've got another hydrogen bond here and here and here. Be careful. These are not actual chemical bonds. They are forces of attraction, little magnetic forces, kind of, sort of, that hold those water molecules together. We call this phenomenon of water molecules sticking to each other cohesion. So water is attracted to other water molecules. That is called cohesion. And that attraction is hydrogen bonding. This allows for lots of amazing things to happen in living systems. One of the coolest ones is transpiration in plants. Transpiration is the process by which water moves against the force of gravity up plants from the roots to the leaves. And it's partially because water is cohesive. And so I'll have one water molecule here and one water molecule here, and they will pull on each other because they're attracted to each other like little magnets, and then they'll pull each other up, and we call that movement up the transpiration stream, little chain of water molecules. Water being attracted to other water molecules was cohesion. Water can also display the property of adhesion. Water can be attracted to other water molecules. That was what we called cohesion. But if water is attracted to something else that is also polar, we call that adhesion. I remember that if I add something that's not water to that force of attraction, it's adhesion, not cohesion. This also happens due to hydrogen bonding. So those forces of attraction occur between water molecules and other polar things, other things that have positives and negatives to them. Those opposites are still attracting. This also helps to support transpiration in plants. Again, that movement of water against the force of gravity up the plant. We talked about cohesion, how those water molecules are attracted to other water molecules and they pull each other up in a chain of water molecules because they're sticking together. But the inside of those tubes through which the water flows, those tubes are called xylem. So the water molecules will also be attracted to the inside of that xylem. So those xylem cell walls composed of cellulose. Cellulose is a little bit polar, and so the water molecules are attracted to the inside of the xylem as well as to each other. So there's both cohesion and adhesion happening here. We can also see adhesion in the lab anytime we use a graduated cylinder with some water, and we see that beautiful meniscus. That meniscus occurs because water molecules are attracted to the glass on the inside of the graduated cylinder, and so they kind of climb over each other to get to stick to the glass. This amazing device is known as a capillary action apparatus or capillary tube apparatus. You fill it with some water, and what's amazing is we can see as the diameters of the tubing decrease, the water is able to creep up a little bit higher, and this is due to that stickiness. So the narrower the tube, the easier it is for the water molecules to kind of climb on top of each other and stick to the inside of the tube, and then the water moves against the force of gravity up the tube due to adhesion. Because water is polar, it also displays some pretty amazing thermal properties. The first one we're going to look at is a high specific heat capacity. Specific heat capacity is the amount of energy required to change 1 gram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. We usually measure it in joules or calories. This table happens to be in joules. We can see that we need 4.18 joules of energy to increase 1 gram of liquid water by 1 degree Celsius. If I'm looking at copper instead, we only need 0.38 of a joule. So 4 plus joules to heat up a gram of water, only a third-ish of a joule to heat up that same gram of copper. We need a lot of energy to heat up water. This means that when the temperature outside changes, us living things with lots of water, we don't change temperature super fast. We don't change temperature as much as copper would. So thank goodness we're not made of copper. Water also has a high latent heat of vaporization. That means a lot of energy is needed to get water to evaporate, like 540 calories for every 1 gram of water. Basically what happens during evaporation, those water molecules that have those hydrogen bonds holding them together, those hydrogen bonds get broken and the water is able to pop away from the other water molecules and become gaseous instead of a liquid. But because those hydrogen bonds are so strong between the water molecules, we need a lot of energy to make that happen, 540 calories. That energy can be absorbed from living things. And so when we sweat, or this super cute doggo panting, what's happening is the water on his tongue is evaporating. And as it evaporates, it takes a lot of energy away from the body of the dog, cooling the dog off. This is the same thing that happens with us and sweat. That amount of sweat is produced, controlled by the hypothalamus, which is in our brains. And we can sweat up to 2 liters per hour if we really, really need to. Because it's hot outside, or sometimes, a lot of you might know this already, a little bit of stress, that adrenaline rush can also definitely heat up the body and lead to that release of some sweat. Water also has a pretty high boiling point for its mass. The molar mass of water is 18 grams per mole-ish. That's not a huge molecule, and yet the boiling point of liquid water is 100 degrees Celsius at normal atmospheric pressures. So the fact that liquid water exists on Earth between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius means that there is a lot of room for liquid water to exist, and liquid water is amazing because we call liquid water the universal solvent. Now, water cannot dissolve the whole entire universe, but it can dissolve a lot of stuff that's also polar. Just like in this image, this is showing the solvation, or that process of dissolving sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is salt. It's an ionic compound. It is composed of positively charged sodium cations and negatively charged chloride anions. The positively charged sodium cations actually end up getting surrounded by water molecules because the negative oxygen side of the water molecule is attracted to the positive charge of that sodium cation. That means that sodium ends up with this bubble of water molecules surrounding it, and that bubble of water can easily move around other water molecules. Similar but opposite happens to the chloride anion. Chloride is negatively charged, it's an anion. It is going to attract the positive hydrogen side of the water molecules, and we end up with another bubble of water, but the water molecules are just flipped around this time. So the positive hydrogen side is attracted to the negative charge of that chloride anion, and we end up with another bubble that can easily move around. And this is how polar substances can be dissolved in water. This in particular ionic compounds, but other polar covalent compounds can be dissolved not with the ions, but in a similar way. And that brings us to some pretty fabulous and important vocabulary. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Hydro, of course, is water. Phil means love, and phobe means to fear, not love. So hydrophilic substances can be attracted to water. Usually these are things that are polar. These polar things will be attracted to water with those hydrogen bonds, and they pretty easily dissolve, like glucose or sodium, and sometimes cellulose. So cellulose is a little bit quirky in its ability to dissolve just because it's a giant molecule. Hydrophobic substances are non-polar. They do not have those positive and negative charges, and so they will not dissolve in water. They will dissolve in each other, but not in water. Examples of hydrophobic non-polar substances, fats and oils, and we can see that in any bottle of oil and vinegar, vinaigrette salad dressing. Of course, the vinegar, which is water and some acetic acid, very polar down here. The oil is going to be up here. The oil is on top because it is less dense, but it doesn't mix because it is non-polar. It's hydrophobic and will not dissolve in the water. Our blood is mostly water. And so our blood does a really good job of moving around things like sodium and chloride and proteins and glucose, things that are polar because most of our blood is actually water. And so it is quite polar. Red blood cells, they've got some charged proteins, white blood cells, platelets. All these guys do a pretty good job of hanging out in the water pretty happily. But we also need to transport fats and lipids, which are hydrophobic, through our bloodstream. That could be a problem since the water in the plasma is not going to be able to dissolve those molecules. And so we have these super cool bubbles called lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are kind of like vesicles in our cells. So they're not in our cells, so we don't call them vesicles. Instead, we call them lipoproteins. And what happens is this. We're going to pack inside this lipoprotein all of the fatty things that will not dissolve very well in our bloodstream because they are hydrophobic. So all kinds of phobic things here on the inside of this lipoprotein bubble. The fatty acid chains of our phospholipids are also hydrophobic. And so these fatty acid chains, hydrophobic, very happy to sit next to these other things like glycerol and cholesterol, which are also hydrophobic. They're very happy to hang out together. The heads of these phospholipids are phosphate groups, and they're actually hydrophilic. And so these molecules, these phospholipid molecules that make up this lipoprotein bubble are what we call amphipathic because they are both hydrophilic. That phosphate head loves to hang out with water, and at the same time they are hydrophobic. Those tails are going to repel the water. But those tails that repel the water are going to be super stable, sitting next to those other lipids, the fats and the oils that we want to move around our bloodstream. Because the outside of this bubble is hydrophilic, the whole bubble very happily moves around the bloodstream. So we can pack the hydrophobic things inside the hydrophilic outside bubble and then just move that whole bubble around together so we can transport our lipids, our fats and oils, and lipoproteins around the bloodstream. But what about super tiny little things like oxygen gas? Oxygen gas is also non-polar, but it's super small, so it kind of sometimes can dissolve a little bit in water just because it's such a small molecule, but it doesn't dissolve super well because it is non-polar. Instead, we have some carrier molecules, and the carrier molecule that we have for oxygen gas, of course, is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein. We're going to stick that protein on and in our red blood cells, fancy word for red blood cell, erythrocyte. The oxygen will be attracted to these hemoglobin molecules, and then we can carry the oxygen around our red blood cells, erythrocytes, through the bloodstream in these molecules of hemoglobin. And my friends, we have accomplished our objectives. We explained the polarity of water. The oxygen side is partially negative. The hydrogen sides are partially positive. That means that we have opposite charges on different sides of the molecule, and that makes it polar. Because it's polar, it is cohesive and adhesive. It has a high specific heat. It has a high heat of vaporization. It is a good solvent. All of these things make water super important for the support of life processes. We also talked about hydrophilic. Phil means love. Some things really love to hang out with water. Hydrophobic, things that are scared of course, no molecules are afraid of water. Molecules don't have emotions like that. They're just attracted or repelled by the water. And then things that are amphipathic, like those phospholipids where they have the phosphate head, that's hydrophilic, and then those fatty acid tails that are hydrophobic. So it is both. That prefix amphi means both hydrophilic and hydrophobic at the same time. Good work today.